Whenever a film fails either financially, critically, or both, there'll be an inquest into why, and on occasion, those who made the picture will look to pass the blame. Not to the actors, nor to the script or any other aspect under their control, but to the audience. Imagine making a movie and deciding it was the fans' fault that it didn't do as well as you wanted it to. No internal questions, no honest reflection about what you could have done better, just a flat out buck passing to the people who had absolutely no hand in the making of the feature whatsoever. Some of the biggest directors in the world have done it, and we're gonna tell you about it. I'm Jess from What Culture, and here are 10 filmmakers who blamed audiences for movie failures. Number 10. Ron Howard, Solo: A Star Wars Story. Star Wars is a strange franchise. It's one of the biggest in the world in terms of pop cultural impact and longevity. Though it's seen something of a renaissance since The Mandalorian first released, there are genuinely more bad Star Wars movies than good ones. Of all of them, however, there's only one Star Wars outing that can be classed as a box office bomb. At less than $400 million, Solo: A Star Wars Story brought in $100 million less than the next lowest box office number from A Galaxy Far, Far Away, which released 35 years earlier, Return of the Jedi. Solo was infamously plagued with issues all throughout production. From Alden Ehrenreich reportedly struggling on set, to a change of directors after 90% of the movie was shot, to making a feature about a backstory that no one really wanted or needed to see. Still, Ron Howard blames the poor performance on the audience, letting their feelings for The Last Jedi, released just 6 months earlier, cloud their judgment. Star Wars fatigue certainly may have been an issue, as well as online trolls who plague far too many cinematic releases, but it seems naive to put all the blame for the flop on these two issues. Number 9. Sam Mendes, Empire of Light. As a director, Sam Mendes is no stranger to the big-budget blockbuster side of Hollywood. The man brought both Skyfall and Spectre to screens in 2012 and 2015 respectively, as well as the exceptional 1917 in 2019. In 2022, however, he saw a different side to the cinematic industry that he didn't like. This was with Empire of Light, a much smaller budgeted movie than his previous mega hits that only brought in $10 million at the box office. Off the back of this disappointment, Mendes announced that cinema was dying. Comparing his outing to the likes of The Fabelmans, Babylon, and Bardo: False Chronicle of a Handful of Truths, the director blamed audiences for wanting to see movies on home release instead of going out into the cinemas. While this is absolutely something that's been plaguing the industry for years and looks to continue doing so for some time, Empire of Light currently sits at a Rotten Tomatoes score of just 45%. Yes, it's understandable to be frustrated with the current video-on-demand climate, but it seems more likely in this particular instance that audiences just didn't like Sam Mendes' most recent offering. Number 8. Billy Eichner, Bros. Social media, similarly to the internet in general, is as much a curse as it is a blessing. The likes of Twitter have given a platform for knee-jerk, poorly thought-out reactions to be directed at millions of people, with absolutely no taking them back. Once something is on the internet, it's not going away. In the fallout of Bros' poor performance at the box office, bringing in less than $5 million on opening weekend, and falling short of $15 million overall, writer Billy Eichner took to social media to pin the blame for his movie's shortcomings squarely on the general public. It goes without saying that diversity and inclusion are incredibly important in cinema, and that stories like Bros need to be seen. But Eichner's response to Bros' poor performance didn't exactly do him any favors. His passion for the project is to be admired, but essentially calling anyone who didn't go to see it a quote homophobic weirdo was possibly a step too far. Eichner tweeted that straight people didn't show up to watch his movie, but in reality, no one did. Number 7. John CROWLEY, The Goldfinch. As far as recent flops go in terms of box office numbers, there aren't many bigger than The Goldfinch. What was once thought to be Oscar bait ultimately turned out to be an outing that woefully underperformed, falling some way short of making up its budget. This was reportedly in the region of $45 million, almost 5 times the eventual intake of less than $10 million. This came in spite of an all-star cast and stellar source material, and is something that director John CROWLEY has blamed on audiences and their streaming devices. According to the director, the superhero genre has taken away from the industry in general, as well as audiences being able to stream instead of having to go watch on the big screen as these movies are made for. CROWLEY believes that thanks to these aspects, there's no longer a place for pieces like The Goldfinch. Though it has a not terrible 72% audience score on Rotten Tomatoes, like Sam Mendes with Empire of Light, CROWLEY seems to be ignoring the putrid 25% critic score. Nothing is going to put people off going to see something more than it being panned by critics, regardless of genre, style, director, or budget. Number 6. Jim Sheridan, Brothers. The majority of filmmakers on this list at least had the decency to wait until their movie actually failed to blame audiences, but not Jim Sheridan. He didn't let something so small as the fact that his effort had yet to be released get in the way. Brothers, starring Jake Gyllenhaal and Tobey Maguire, was incredibly heavy, dealing with the damage and PTSD inflicted on soldiers thanks to the war in Afghanistan. Against a budget of $26 million, it brought in just $43 million globally. A disappointing figure to be sure, but not exactly a surprising one. This kind of war movie wouldn't typically invite bums on seats in the cinema, and it was realistically never going to be a hit at the box office. But even so, Sheridan took his shots at potential audiences for not seeing it, before they hadn't seen it. In an interview published 1 month before release, the director blasted the American public for not knowing there was a war on at all, and therefore having no reason to go watch a film based around it. He may have had a point since Brothers underperformed in spite of generally favorable reviews, but at least give it a chance first. Number 5. DIABLO CODY, Jennifer's Body. Just 2 months before the release of Jim Sheridan's Brothers, and less than a month before he slated his potential audiences, Jennifer's Body released to an underwhelming and disappointing $7 million domestic opening. Even something as simple as the movie's title, particularly when considering Megan Fox as the titular character just 2 years after hitting the mainstream in Transformers, and how the marketing was based on mindless sex appeal, it's not surprising people didn't rush to cinemas to see it. Now, almost 15 years later, fans can appreciate Jennifer's Body for what it is, which is so much more than what was promised in the trailers. It's become something of a cult classic in recent times, but writer DIABLO CODY still isn't happy with this. Fans should have appreciated the film 15 years ago, and she's not happy about it. Instead of aiming this at those who didn't see it at the time, Cody's anger should really be directed towards the marketing team, who did absolutely nothing to draw in its intended audience. Who knew that trying to bring in a male audience with images of a scantily clad Megan Fox wouldn't sell tickets for a movie actually aimed towards teenage girls. Number 4. Ridley Scott, The Last Duel. In the face of such a big disappointment as a movie falling way under expectations at the box office, there are several ways to react. Accept the situation with quiet dignity, shamelessly blame the audience it was made for instead of admitting fault with the final cut itself, or attack the stereotype of an entire generation. When The Last Duel released in 2021 to become one of the biggest commercial flops of the year, making just $27 million against a budget of $100 million, director Ridley Scott took aim at millennials and swung for the fences. The legendary director isn't necessarily used to such a scenario, and he showed as much in his response. Casting an incredibly wide generalization, Scott blamed his failure on millennials and their quote, fucking cell phones. Of course, this generation's been brought up with technology that wasn't available in years gone by, but is it really fair to blame The Last Duel's failure solely on such a thing? What about the fact that the movie released during the height of the worldwide pandemic in 2021? Or that just 45 days after its theatrical release, it was available on Disney+? Blaming nothing but mobile phones and Facebook feels like a lazy and bitter response. Number 3. Peter Berg, Battleship. Over the last 15 years, the entire cinematic industry has been changed drastically by the emergence of the superhero genre. While the likes of Spider-Man and the X-Men had huge popularity, it wasn't until 2008 with the debut of Iron Man and the establishment of the MCU that the tide began to turn. There have been plenty of filmmakers who've spoken out and talked down on comic book movies in recent years, arguably most notably Martin Scorsese, but one of the first to be affected by the phenomenon was Peter Berg. The director of 2012's Battleship had the unenvious release spot just weeks before Marvel's The Avengers, at the time the most ambitious crossover in cinematic history. Whereas the 6th MCU outing easily surpassed $1 billion, Battleship barely scratched $300 million. Certainly not a terrible return, particularly when compared to some of the entries on this list, but take into account the $200 million budget and you can see the problem. According to Berg, Battleship struggled because everyone went to watch The Avengers 5 times instead of his own film. Perhaps more of an issue was that those who did go to see Battleship came together for a rotten score of 54%, something that was actually better than the 31% critic score. Number 2. Elizabeth Banks, Charlie's Angels. As part of the reboot trend in Hollywood, Elizabeth Banks' Charlie's Angels reimagining in 2020 undoubtedly qualifies as a flop. Following the all-female entries in the Oceans and Ghostbusters franchises, the marketing for Charlie's Angels portrayed the outing as something of a feminist movement, when in reality, Banks was just making an action movie. Though the director does acknowledge where the marketing department let her creation down, she accredits the blame for the box office failure to potential male audiences not going to see it. Even in spite of the huge successes of Captain Marvel and Wonder Woman, two outings Banks discounted as they're part of male genres, the director suggested that men won't go see a female-led offering. Even if you take the point she makes about Captain Marvel and Wonder Woman being part of larger shared universes, it seems surprising that the filmmaker wouldn't consider the success of the Hunger Games franchise, in which she herself starred. Led by Jennifer Lawrence, the Hunger Games brought in just under $3 billion across 4 entries, and seemingly disproves Banks' theory that female-led movies can't see commercial success. That's not to say sexism and toxic masculinity among audiences isn't a huge issue. Look no further than the attacks on the recent trailer for the Marvels and the review bombing of several female-led projects, but to look at nothing else as a factor in a film's failure feels like an oversimplification. Number 1. Pete Docter, Lightyear. It's a crying shame when a popular franchise begins to outstay its welcome. What started out as something beloved by fans ultimately turned sour, and incredibly, seemingly certain to join the likes of Pirates of the Caribbean, Die Hard, and many, many more, is Toy Story. The recent announcement of Toy Story 5 was met largely with groans and skepticism rather than excitement. And coming off the back of the commercial disaster that was Lightyear, folks might not have too much time for Woody and Buzz anymore. The latter was the subject of the franchise's first spin-off, but not in the traditional sense. Lightyear wasn't another entry about the toys fans are connected with over the 3 previous decades. It was the in-universe movie that made Buzz Lightyear an icon, and from which the toys were produced. According to the Pixar legend and Lightyear executive producer Pete Docter, this concept was something audiences just couldn't grasp. Apparently, when fans see Buzz, their immediate reaction is to look for Woody and Mr. Potato Head, which holds more weight than the fact that this was something that nobody truly either needed or wanted, and that Tim Allen was nowhere to be heard. At the end of the day, Toy Story should have gone no further than the perfect trilogy ending it had, and that's that. That's the end of our list, but let me know down in that comment section if you can think of any other filmmakers who blamed audiences for movie failures. As always, I've been Jess from What Culture. Thank you so much for hanging out with me. If you like, you can come say hi to me on my Twitter account where I'm at Jess McDonald, but make sure you stay tuned to us here for plenty more great lists.